My name is Mathias Vermeulen. I work for the European Parliament and I'm affiliated with the Center for Law, Science and Technology Studies here at Free University of Brussels, and I will be the chair of this panel today. I just want to briefly highlight two housekeeping matters. Unfortunately, Mr. Bente Erichsen from the Nobel Peace Center and Mark Schissler from NATO couldn't join us, but we are very pleased to have Mr. Dennis Broeders joining us for this panel. If you're not really awake yet, then I'm really sure that that this panel will be your wake-up call. We will discuss how to avert cyberwar. And every time I think about the word cyberwar, I have to think back to last summer when I went on to Amazon.com and I was looking for books on cyberwar. And then the first two hits that I saw was first, there will be cyberwar, and the second one was titled "Cyberwar Will Not Take Place." So just to say that there are actually quite a lot of different perspectives on this particular issue. Now, judging from the title of this panel, I think we are taking a rather cautious approach. And I think the organizer of this panel, Professor Deborah Hurley, you can all read a short biography, so I'm not going to dwell too much on their backgrounds. Without any further ado, I'm going to give you the floor, and then you can also maybe enlighten us about the title of this panel. Is it really 5 minutes to midnight to avert cyberwar?
Thank you very much, Matthias. Good morning. I think that the answer to that question may become apparent as each of the speakers addresses you this morning. Back in 1991 and 1992, I had the pleasure to draft the guidelines for the security of information systems and negotiate them with the OECD member countries. In doing that, along the way, we coined the CIA terminology, that CIA acronym, for security of information systems, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I won't describe what each of those is. We can certainly do that if you wish later, but I want to focus for a moment. All three of them relate to the threat of cyber war, but particularly the notion of availability, that information systems be available to authorized parties in the authorized manner at the authorized times as desired. So certainly one of the biggest threats to the continued functioning of our global information network is cyber war. And I don't like to talk only about cyberspace, although I'm sure we're going to use that terminology today. I think it's much too narrow. The term I prefer is the ubiquitous information environment. And if we think into the near future, we can think again of this just pervasive environment where computing devices are not only in solids, but routinely in liquids and gases. You're breathing them in, breathing them out. Some are residing in you. You know, people already talk about wearables or the Internet of Things, which again I think is too narrow, but this notion of a really pervasive information environment. So one of the biggest threats to the continued functioning of this cyberspace, I'll use that term, is cyber war, both often, and there are offensive elements to cyber war and defensive. So in this conference, quite rightly and quite importantly, we talk a lot about protection of personal data, we talk a lot about security of information systems, but it's quite common in general, and particularly also in our field, for people to ignore some of the biggest threats that are sitting largely to the side, you know, the elephant in the room, to pretend they don't exist because they don't know how to begin to address it. Over 15 years ago, the People's Liberation Army in China, there was an announcement that the special unit was being formed in the People's Liberation Army specifically to become expert in cyber warfare. So this is not a new issue. This is something that's been around, again, even from and before the time of the negotiation and adoption of the security guidelines in 1991 and 1992. And we've seen many examples, and some I'm sure will come up during the course of this panel, of offensive action by countries, many countries now, including Russia quite frequently, China, and also the United States now has engaged in offensive cyber warfare, not only defensive, which I would assert is an incredibly dangerous game for the United States since it is the most vulnerable cyber country on earth because it is so heavily dependent on information infrastructure, and so much of that infrastructure is in private hands. Now let's take a moment to get some perspective here. I want to mention also this is not what's called an NBC threat, so nuclear, biological, or chemical threat. Cyber warfare is a different kind of threat, and it's different in the sense that it's not species ending. So nuclear threats, biological especially, can be species-ending, in other words, the human species. Chemical, a little more arguably, yes or no, depending on how exactly it would be implemented. It would have to be extremely well implemented to be species-ending. But at the same time, normally, in any kind of warfare, you try and pull all the levers available to you to break the will of the adversary, to cause dread in the population, and so forth, all the classical things that are done in a war scenario. And the cyber elements present very powerful additional elements to add to any other kind of war threat, or they can also provide a great deal of degradation, not only destruction, but degraded service over time. So this is a growing concern, and a growing concern especially because more and more of our economy and society are dependent on the continued functioning of cyberspace. So this concern, where it was 15 or 20 years ago, a concern perhaps of a few researchers and governments who were paying attention, has now become a wider concern, not only of governments, but especially of companies are starting to pay a lot of attention to this because they realize and recognize the tremendous impact on their businesses that's possible. So one of the hallmarks of the internet has been the notion of disintermediation. So how do we disintermediate cyber war? How do we go about that process? And so an exploration has been ongoing about mechanisms that might be initiated or put in place to help to reduce the threat of cyber war, or to put it more positively, to foster cyber peace. So I'm going to describe briefly, very briefly, one concrete proposal that is underway. Certainly many other mechanisms are possible. This is not the only solution or the solution, the way it will be done, and you'll be hearing about some other research and activities that are going on already, but to try and begin to map this terrain in a concrete way. So the proposal that I'm going to describe is a cyberspace non-armament accord. And an accord can be anything from a declaration by governments to some sort of treaty or convention, so it can be binding, non-binding, whatever. I'm not terribly fussed about its legal effect at this point in that manner. We're in early days with this, but a cyberspace non-armament accord. And the reason for that is that there already exists a tradition of non-armament accords where governments have said over time that a particular item, a particular aspect, is part of the common heritage of humanity, and that this particular thing, whatever it might be, should be devoted exclusively or exclusively reserved for peaceful and scientific purposes. And I'll give you, there are a number of non-armament accords that have existed for decades, so this is familiar terrain. I'll give you two examples because they're more well known to the general public. And they are the Antarctic Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty. So both of those treaties, those non-armament treaties, so again an agreement by parties to keep their hands off it and not militarize those spaces, both of those agreements were initiated, negotiated, and adopted in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. So I find it difficult to argue that even though we do live in fraught times and dangerous times, that the times are any more fraught than they were when people had the vision to create these other non-armament treaties during the height of the Cold War. Some may argue, and so some may argue as well, that, oh my God, if we have another international agreement or whatever it might be, this creates another large bureaucracy. This is not necessarily the case, although all of us are now thinking, I can. But it's not necessary that we create some gigantic bureaucracy with many, many meetings and many, many people. And I'll just give another brief example. With regard to the Antarctic Treaty, for example, it was adopted, I believe, in 1961, in the early 1960s. And the mechanism for administering it was an annual meeting by the parties to it, at which they would thrash out or discuss any particular issues they might have. They finally set up a secretariat in 2004, so between 1961 and 2004, no secretariat at all. It was set up in 2004. It is 8 people in Buenos Aires. That is the entire secretariat that administers the Antarctic Treaty. So a very small bureaucracy. I want to give another example because we need to approach this from several different perspectives. The other example is the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the reason I mention that is because, as we all know, a large part of cyberspace is in private hands. So in Antarctica or outer space, you may not have as many private actors, but in cyberspace, certainly there are many. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, when it was negotiated and adopted in the late 80s and 1990s, specifically contemplated and accounted for the private sector, since many chemicals and chemical precursors are in the hands legitimately of private industry. So again, we have examples such as this where we take into account, the agreement takes into account and includes the private sector and their action. And so for the Chemical Weapons Convention, for the general public and for many people, they were completely unaware of it, although it was put in place in the 90s. But a recent example in Syria, of course, showed the utility of having something like that already on the shelf when a particular situation arose. It was able to be resolved quite quickly using the Chemical Weapons Convention. A third example I'll give you, again approaching this from quite a different angle, but looking at possible mechanisms, is the International Telecommunication Union. That is the oldest, the ITU is the oldest international organization. It was founded in the 1860s. And from its very beginning, this is quite radical, and most people don't realize this, but from its beginning, its membership included not only governments, but the private sector. And the reason for that was that some of the global telegraph system, as it was developing, it was not completely in place. Much of it was, similar to where we are now with regard to cyberspace, that much of it was in private hands. And so this necessity to include the private sector and make them a part of it as well. And so that time back in the 1860s, a recognition of the importance of this resource, the telegraph, this new technology, and the desire to protect it properly. This process that I'm describing, the non-armament accord, has been begun because of political conditions currently in the tradition of the Track 2 or Pugwash conferences. So as a Track 2 process, involving governments are participating, researchers, non-governmental organizations, and others to try and create the ground, to try and do the initial thinking and frameworks to then bring this into a wider audience and more use. So the vision here is that something should be done, and it should be done soon and now. I encourage all of us to give you another example of a vision that someone had or that a group of people had many years ago that this audience will be familiar with, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So right after World War II, everything is still smoking, the fires are still burning. Some group of people had the vision to say, you know, we must put a stake very firmly down on the other side, you know, at the opposite pole of what we've all just experienced, and create this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which they did do and then was adopted and signed onto in 1948. So to conclude, this is a process. Rome was not built in a day, although you can buy many things on Amazon, including books on cyberwar. I don't think you can obtain a cyberspace non-armament accord on Amazon yet. If you can, let me know after this talk. But it is important, I think, to set a vision, to place our feet on the path, and to begin to work toward this goal. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. It's a fascinating presentation, and it already brings a lot of questions to my mind. For instance, how relevant is it still, are these analogies with traditional arms treaties when we are in a context of cyberspace, to use that very ugly word? How can we control lines of code in the same way as we can control chemical weapons, for instance? Can we really talk about cyber war as a war as such, or is it just going to be an element of more new forms of hybrid warfare, for instance? So a lot of food for thought. I think our next speaker is also extremely interesting because he has published a report for the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. Professor Dennis Broeders is a senior research fellow at the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy, an advisory body to the Dutch government, and a professor of technology and society at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And he has really developed this idea of a core of the internet which should be a zone of non-interference. And I think he will talk much more about this in his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I was lured into this panel yesterday, and I get to replace a 3-star general, so what's not to like? I would like to do a few things, a few comments on, first on the title of the conference, which has already been mentioned, and then react to Hurley's comments, and then set out something about the public core of the internet. Because I was also looking at the title of the panel, and it says 5 minutes to midnight, and I thought, really? Why? Why? It's probably also to draw a crowd in. I mean, it's Friday morning, and you're all here, so maybe that was the reason you're here. But the 5 minutes to midnight is a metaphor that refers to the doomsday clock. And the doomsday clock is a clock that ticks back to global catastrophe, usually a nuclear catastrophe. And it was first shown on the 1947 edition of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and was really closely related to nuclear holocaust, basically. And that sort of makes you wonder, I mean, where is the cyber war? Where is it? I mean, is it Stuxnet? Yeah, Stuxnet was a deed of aggression, but is it a full-on cyber war? Was it the Sony hack? I don't know. I don't think that's really cyber warfare. It was talked about as cyber warfare, but that does not necessarily make it so. And the trouble with cyber warfare is that you can't prove a negative. You can't say it will never happen, because it might happen. It's possible. It's possible to disrupt everything, but that does not necessarily mean that it will happen. It may. And it also does not necessarily mean that this is the biggest threat to security on the internet that we have at this moment. So that's for that. I agree with a lot of things in Deborah's talk, and obviously as academics I also disagree with some things, or I have amendments on it. I agree very much with the idea that cyberspace should be a protected zone. I also think we should be very, very precise in our language in saying, okay, what do we talk about when we talk about cyberspace? It can't be everything. I think there is a lot to be gained with the use of very precise language, especially when it comes to talking about the internet and security. National security is one element of it, but there's other forms of security and they need to be disentangled much more. I also agree that there is a threat to cyberspace, and I also agree that it comes from various quarters, but it also comes from national states, and it has a lot to do with the security imperative, but not just the security imperative. And I also think that a diplomatic process, I agree there, that a diplomatic process has to be started. Like Deborah said, it has already started, it's an ongoing thing. But I think it's a good thing to start talking about this now, start talking about the various levels, because if we leave it as is, if we don't take this tack and we leave it basically the development to the security actors, I think we will end up with a very different sort of internet indeed in a couple of years. And then there's a couple of things that we may disagree on. I think it's way too early to talk about treaties. I think we lack a common language. We lack the building blocks that you need to talk about a treaty. I think it would be an extremely cumbersome process. In the end, you would end up with something that is good to neither man or beast. So I think that's, for now at least, not the way to go. I also think that cyberspace as a whole, Deborah said it's not inclusive enough. I think it's over-inclusive. It's a much too big term to use in a diplomatic round like this. As soon as you add the content layer, as soon as you add the World Wide Web layer, there is automatic disagreement about what cyberspace should and should not be. And thirdly, Mathias also referred to that, I think analogies may be unhelpful. Cyberspace is not different in every aspect, but the analogies are very difficult and they may be unhelpful. There's some people compare the internet and they talk about the law of the sea. Well, the sea is a very different thing. For one thing, it's not partially private. For another thing, I have a friend who works at the Amsterdam Internet Exchange. If he pulls all the plugs and flicks off all the switches, 1/3 of the internet is gone. I would have you try that with the sea, so that would be difficult. Also, 0 days are not chemical weapons. I mean, the binding factor to do something about chemical weapons is a very broad and general idea of abhorrence at what those weapons are. And 0 days are hardly in the public eye, and they're definitely not met with the same kind of disgust that was used to build the Chemical Weapons Treaty on. So, analogies may be useful, but we need to be very carefully at what parts may be transposed to another area. So what then? This is all nitpicking. Well, here's my 2 cents. Given the current political situation, given the lack of a common vocabulary, I think we should start with norms. And this is something that has been on the way. There's many places where people from the security side, from the internet technical community side, talk about what kind of norms do we need for governments, for example, to interact in cyberspace. A norm that we sort of tried to develop in this report, called the Public Core of the Internet, it's on the web. You can download it for free if you want to. That's a report we've done for the Scientific Council, and that is soon going to be part of the diplomatic agenda of the Netherlands. And the main argument we do here, and I'll try to do it as quick as I can. I'm looking at the chair, he doesn't look at me, that's a good sign. The main argument here is that there is a core of internet protocols, there's a core of internet infrastructure that can be considered a global public good. Now when we talk about that, we don't mean the internet as a whole. We don't mean the internet as an area for free speech. We mean very specific parts of the internet architecture, basically. We're talking about the IP, we're talking about the DNS system, we're talking about border gateway patrols. Very limited subset that we basically all need for everyone. Every digitizing or digitized country needs that core to function, because we built our internet economies on it, we built our internet societies on it, we built our e-governments on it. We need basically that core to function according to the CIA principles. It needs to do what it says in the box, basically. That's what we need. So for a country like the Netherlands, and you also refer to America playing a dangerous game in the sense that they are the most vulnerable because they are very digitized. For countries like that, so the preservation of the core, making sure that it stays working as we think it works, is almost like an extended national interest. So the national interest almost perfectly aligns with the global public good. It is in our interest that that core keeps functioning. However, this is not a given. In many governments there are more than one. The government is a useful fiction, but in part it's always many governments. So the internet, also that core, is under threat from state activities, especially from security, but also from other angles. It's also copyright legislation that has implementation schemes that are damaging to DNS system, for example. We remember the uproar about SOPA, PIPA, the ACTA process. No, I can do that. Also censorship and surveillance, overblocking, IP blocking, security agents on the internet. There is a classic internet security that is sort of done by the CERT community, who look after the functioning of the internet in a technical sense. That is very different from what agencies do that work on national security, who build in backdoors in hardware and software, who stockpile 0 days for later use, who try to corrupt standards. That is damaging to that core. And also matters of technological sovereignty. Technological sovereignty, so keeping your data within certain borders, is not necessarily a problem, but if you set it up in such a way that you also need to circumvent certain routing protocols, it does become a problem in terms of the public core of the internet and how the internet functions. So what do we need to do is, we set out to say, okay, what we need is to establish and disseminate a norm, an international standard stipulating that the internet's public core, so its main protocols and its main infrastructure, must be safeguarded against unwarranted intervention by states. We focus on states in the report. There's more to be said, but that's our demarcation. If you look at the book, you will not find a blueprint of what the public core is. That is, if it's a viable concept, that is step 2. We need to define, demarcate in a broader sense, okay, what is this public core and how do we set about doing this? And the advantage of doing this through a norms-based approach is that you can then sort of try to disseminate this idea in many various diplomatic areas. You can use the EU, you can use the UN, you can use basically every venue that is open to you, and you can do it through your own diplomatic channels. And I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Dennis, also for keeping up with the time. Again, a lot of food for thought. I think it's very crucial what you were saying, like let's be very careful with analogies. I still remember a Vanity Fair cover in 2011 which said Stuxnet is the Hiroshima of cyberwar, which I think is a gross offense to all Hiroshima survivors. And then of course there's indeed this very interesting idea of the public core of the internet and which elements of the internet would actually be a part of it. I think it's now more time for the more practical, or people actually with not being academics but having work experience in the field, so to say. Maybe Diana Alonso Blas is not the first person you would expect at this panel. She is the data protection officer at EUROJUST and also head of the data protection service at EUROJUST. So Diana, what are you actually doing here at this panel?
Well, thanks very much, Mathias. To be honest, this is the first question I asked Deborah when she sent me an email. I said, well, thanks very much for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to see you again, but, well, what is my role here? And then she managed to explain me what would be the purpose of my presentation here. I hope you will agree with me when I finish that there is an interest in what I have to say. I mean, in fact, my area of expertise is obviously data protection, the field I'm working on since 1994. And I do have some knowledge of criminal law as well, due to my studies, but also through my work at EUROJUST, where I'm the data protection head of service since 2003. So what I'm going to talk about is more from this perspective of criminal law and international cooperation. But let me go first to the point of, well, what is cyberwar? And I have to confess, preparing this panel, I was wondering, what do we really mean with this? It seems to me that in a way, every bad action that takes place on cyberspace is considered as cyberwar. How do we define that? And, well, maybe I'm a very down-to-earth person, and I mean, I'm very well aware of the difficulties of applying criminal law in this area due to territoriality and all that. But still, I believe that criminal law is the main and the only tool we have to fight criminal activities, both online, offline. And I mean, of course, we need to tackle this, taking into account the cross-border aspects, the international aspects, but still, I think criminal law should be the main tool we have. And I believe the proper use of criminal law will be then a way of making cyberspace more robust. So as I said, and Mathias mentioned, I work for EUROJUST. EUROJUST is the European Union Agency for Judicial Cooperation. So we work in the field of serious organized crime involving 2 or more member states. EUROJUST was created in 2002, and well, I have to say we are not as popular as our neighbors at Europol. We are doing pretty well, I would say. We started back in 2002 with 200 cases a year, and last year we dealt with 2,214 cases, which I believe is quite a big increase through the years. And one of the main priority areas of the work of EUROJUST is cybercrime, which is more related to this topic here today. Our objective there is to fight against cybercrime and the criminal misuse of the internet by organized criminal groups. In 2015, we have dealt with 62 cases of cybercrime involving 2 or more member states, and 15 of those cases involve also third states. Third states with whom we can work due to the international cooperation agreements we have in place, including very extensive data protection clauses, let me mention that, and also we can work with them through the EU existing agreements that are with other countries as well. We have organized in some of these cases also what we call a coordination center, meaning that it's like a joint action day in which from EUROJUST actions are coordinated in member states, searches, etc. So I believe that both Europol and EUROJUST have an important and complementary role to play in this area. And this has been highlighted by practitioners as well. We can conduct analysis, we can offer expertise, experience, and also access to counterparts, meaning the cybercrime units in the member states, the prosecution services. So we can both support the member states by providing assistance in those areas through the whole process of investigation and prosecution. And maybe give you one example, a case which has been reported in the press a few times is the so-called Black Sails case. This is linked to a malware which enabled buyers to intrude, monitor, and remotely access and control the computer of the victim. This is something which was identified first by the FBI and reported, and then EUROJUST and Europol got involved in the case at the end of 2013, and a common action took place involving 16 countries in May 2014, resulting at the end in 359 house searches, 97 arrests, and seizures of more than 1,000 data storage devices. And there it was proof indeed that the involvement of EUROJUST and Europol could play quite an important role. EUROJUST has invested heavily in this area during the last years. We have a task force on cybercrime. Since July 2015, we have one person, a seconded national expert, acting as cybercrime expert, who is also representing Eurojust at the Europol Cybercrime Center, the EC3. We have organized meetings with experts, strategic meetings in 2014, tactical meeting in 2015, and there will be more. And the idea is to have a network of experts working in this area linked to us. There are three main areas in which Eurojust has worked. The admissibility of e-evidence, which of course is a very complex one, transport access to the data, and also issues related to data retention. And there we have advised sometimes to work more from data preservation instead of data retention, which is a useful way to preserve data, but is also more protected from the data protection viewpoint. Also, the differences in investigative methods between the member states and third countries have been explored from our side, as they have a huge impact on the issue of admissibility of evidence. And member states have underlined this importance of this type of work we have done, saying that the involvement of Eurojust would be beneficial, as the agency can assist and facilitate cooperation by advising on a number of issues, such as the initiation of parallel investigations, transfers of proceedings, identifying which member state is in the best position to prosecute, or the avoidance of the non-bis in idem problems at a later stage. So in general, Eurojust involvement at an early stage has been seen as the best chance for a smooth cooperation and coordination of cybercrime investigations, which on the one hand may maximize the risk of encountering legal obstacles, and on the other hand guarantees the resolution of those obstacles if they occur. So I realize I'm giving you a huge publicity plug of Eurojust. That's what I'm paid for, of course. But the main element for me is to underline here that we need to address criminal activities in cyberspace in a way which is in accordance with the criminal law, but also preserving human rights and dignity. And this is the goal we have. We are part of the EU area of security, justice, and freedom. And these three elements need to go together. And we need to respect fundamental rights. This should be a must. And I would say, even from the perspective of criminal law, it is a key element if you want to ensure that whatever evidence you have is admissible in court at a later stage. So from our side, we aim at ensuring admissibility of evidence in judicial proceedings, increase the effectiveness of the prosecutions, and where appropriate, confiscation of assets as well. So this is the experience I can bring in. It's much more practical. It's much more from the idea of criminal law cooperation between member states. And I hope this will be useful for the further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana, for reminding us of the importance of criminal law in tackling indeed many activities which are usually being dealt with under the banner of cyberwar. I think if we look at many of the purpose of activities which are being called cyber warfare, then basically we are mainly talking about acts of subversion or espionage or sabotage, and I think indeed criminal law has an interesting role to play there. Our final speaker in the panel is now Mr. Timothy Edgar, and he is an excellent person to provide us again with a reality check after the two proposals that we have heard here. He has been the first Director of Privacy and Civil Liberties for the White House National Security Staff, and Timothy was also the first Deputy for Civil Liberties for the Director of National Intelligence. Timothy, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Matthias. So I think my role in this panel is to sound a skeptical note on the idea of declaring that cyberspace is a non-armament zone or some other way of having an international instrument or treaty that would regulate or ban cyber weapons. I'm going to describe really two, what I think of, at least at present, as being insurmountable obstacles to this kind of proposal. And the first is, I don't see that the most important countries or states in this area have a mutual interest in any kind of international agreement that would limit their cyber offensive capabilities because they don't agree on basic terms. And I don't see them agreeing on those things anytime soon. And then the second reason is because of pretty much insurmountable attribution and verification problems that exist in the case of cyber war that don't exist in other areas where arms control agreements have been successful. So I want to get into those. But before I do, I just want to outline where I think we are in terms of the baseline of what international law currently says. I'm not going to get into detail, but just The absence of a specific agreement on use of cyber weapons doesn't mean that there's no law here. It means that the general law of international armed conflict applies in the case of cyber weapons, just as it would with any kind of kinetic weapon. So that includes the international law of resort to force under the UN Charter, Article 2.4, as well as international humanitarian law. So one of the bigger areas that people are concerned about, attacks, broad attacks on cyber-critical infrastructure, I think most international lawyers would argue are already prohibited by international humanitarian law because it lacks distinction and proportionality. Now, you might say, well, but countries may do this anyway, despite the existence of this prohibition. If that's true, I don't see why they would obey a treaty either. They're already bound by international law here. Having another international agreement that limits them isn't going to do anything to add to that obligation that they already have. So let me get into the broad national interest point that I make. I think there's two ways of interpreting a possible cyber arms treaty. One way is sort of the Western way, and the other way is the Russian way. And I'm oversimplifying here, but it was the Russians who brought forth the proposal to ban cyber weapons in the late 90s, and it was the Western countries who largely rejected that proposal. Why did they do that? Well, one reason is because Russians defined cyberspace to include the information space, and to say that every country should have sovereignty over its own information space. The support for dissidents online and free speech online was, in this understanding, a cyber weapon to be used against the social stability of a country like Russia. China also shares this view on the sovereignty of their information space. So if we adopt a treaty that says that when the United States complains to China that they're filtering the internet, they would say, you're interfering with our sovereign information space and you're militarizing cyberspace because you're using it as a weapon against our society. None of us in this room would agree with that interpretation or would say that that makes sense, but I would point out that Russia and China are important international actors here, and if that's the way they would interpret a ban on cyber weapons, we would have to persuade them why they should instead go for a more narrow view. If you go for the sort of Western or US, Western European view, we would say, no, that's out of scale. We're talking about attacks on civilian critical infrastructure, and we don't want to include most countries. Maybe this crowd would feel differently, but most countries would not want to include intelligence gathering. They would want to say that intelligence gathering is permitted, just as it is now. We're talking about cyber warfare, not intelligence gathering. Well, then the question is, why is Russia or China have an interest in agreeing to that? What are we giving up in reality for this agreement? The things that we care about that affect other countries that they worry about, such as extensive intelligence gathering capabilities, are off the table. And our support for these internet freedom initiatives, that's off the table. We're not giving those things up, so what's the incentive for them to agree to it? So that's on the issue of why I don't think there's a mutual interest. I think there's a disagreement here about fundamental values of what we are talking about and what we're trying to do, and that means that it's hard to imagine that a treaty would be successful. Another point here is attribution and verification. So there are three levels of attribution, and you're talking about cyber warfare, and all three of them are very difficult. The first is the technical level: which computer and where. That's important. If the President of the United States gets, the presidential daily brief in the morning and they say, Mr. President, China is attacking us, we have a 42% level of confidence that it's China and not somebody pretending to be China. What do you do with that? You're going to launch the cyber war on China? You're going to call them up and yell at them for violating your non-armament accord? You only have a 42% confidence that it's even coming from China. The next is the human behind the computer. So, okay, we've figured out that it really is China, but we're not sure which human being is launching the attack. Maybe it's a Russian agent that went into China and launched it from China. Maybe it's somebody launching a rogue attack. And then there's the legal question of attribution. So maybe we've got the technical attribution, we've got the human attribution, but are these people actually connected to the state? Does the state bear responsibility, is the legal way of putting it, for the attack? And in many cases, offensive cyber operations have been launched by people that the state has sort of disavowed any responsibility for. In some cases, we have been able to penetrate all 3 levels of attribution, but we rarely do so in real time. It's often months or even years later based on technical information. And in any case, the state still denies responsibility typically. So there's usually some level of uncertainty. And that's because states in this area are both credit-seeking and blame-avoiding. So what do I mean by that? Well, they want to deter other actors. They want to get credit for successful attacks. They want to avoid the blame for attacks that might cause them problems in the international sphere. There's an easy way to do that. It's called leaks. The United States government has not confirmed, and I'm not confirming just to get myself not in trouble, the fact that Stuxnet was a U.S. operation, but there's been broad reported leaks that it was. Why? Because you wanted to get credit for this ingenious operation to show the world that the Obama administration is a tough on Iran. But you want to avoid the blame, and you want to avoid the possibility of unintended consequences, so there isn't an official announcement. It's leaked. When you have these problems of attribution, what it does is it takes away the costs of violation. And even in the area of international law, a cost of violation is an important way in which international law is enforced. Obviously, there's no world government in which people are arrested, although there are criminal responsibilities for violation of the law of war. That requires attribution. You have to know who it is. Other types of sanctions, including economic sanctions or reputational damage, deterrence, the credible threat that you guys have crossed a red line, you're using chemical weapons here, so we're going to have more support for our military action against you. That's why you don't want to do it. That all depends on attribution. And there's a reciprocity element to international law, even where we're talking about fundamental values, which is that we have to feel sort of that we're all in this together, and everybody can hide behind somebody else's computer and deny responsibility and then just leak it when we want to, then you take away the costs of violation. When you do that, it's difficult to come to a binding or even a non-binding international agreement. Then related but different from attribution is the issue of verification. So think about this for a minute. What we're asking people to do is to write an international instrument that would prohibit writing and storing bad computer code. So how exactly are we going to do that? It's very hard to distinguish, even if we did discover that some country, China, the US, had on a computer somewhere in one of its government office buildings a bunch of bad computer code, 0 days. How do we distinguish that from what is permitted, espionage activity, intelligence activity, where often there's dual use for this kind of 0-day attacks? In the kinds of arms agreements that have been successful, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself by saying the Iran deal is successful, but let's assume that maybe it is, there needs to be tremendous technical precision in defining exactly what the countries are supposed to be doing. That's why there were all these technical annexes to the Iran agreement. But if you add technical detail to this kind of cyber arms agreement, you destroy the weapon. The technical description of the weapon destroys the weapon itself, because the weapon is supposed to be it's supposed to be an unknown vulnerability. As soon as you use it or disclose it in an arms agreement, it's no longer useful. So you have to describe it without describing the technical detail, but then you've destroyed the ability to have a more effective international agreement. Who would be allowed to monitor our private networks to enforce this? We already limit, every country certainly in represented here has legal limits on what kinds of surveillance powers you can use. Are we going to offer an international organization carte blanche to spy on internet traffic to ensure that malicious code hasn't originated from one of the countries involved in this agreement? And then in terms of the latency period for breach, again, going back to the Iran agreement, that was one of the big issues in the discussion was, what if Iran cheats? How long will it take for them to get a nuclear bomb? Was it 1 year? Was it 10 years? Was it 5 years? This was the big advantage. In the case of malicious computer code and cyber arms, the latency period is going to be 0 or even worse because we won't even know when the attack actually happens. So if I'm right about if I'm wrong about this, I hope you'll understand that this talk was designed to identify the hurdles involved and what you're going to have to address in drafting your non-armament accord. So if you can solve all the problems I just laid out, great, we've got a non-armament accord, fantastic. If I'm right about it, then I would suggest that the focus to avert cyber war should be on deterrence, and that includes strengthening the defense of cyberspace, making our networks less vulnerable, and that it should also be on resilience. So in the case of an actual cyber attack, how are we going to recover quickly and minimize the damage to civilian infrastructures? Just one final response to Dennis's point about maybe we can't do a treaty, but we can do norms. And I'm going to quote from, and I'm indebted a little bit for some of these remarks already, so I should give some credit to Jack Goldsmith's article, Cybersecurity Treaties, A Skeptical View. Not so much just because I think he's a great professor, but mainly because I think it's persuasive. He said, anonymity is a norm destroyer. That's right. Anonymity is a norm destroyer. And I think that's right. If you look at the Stuxnet example, even though we may all agree that this must have been a US/Israeli operation, how exactly do you identify the norm that emerged from that incident? When there's no opinio juris, when the state practice is very minimal, you're going to have a very hard time coming up with norms when countries don't agree that they're actually doing the thing that you are saying that they are doing. Because the whole point of a norm is a country agrees to a particular practice, and if it may harden into customary law based on opinio juris. There's not going to be any opinio juris when you have basically a covert operation. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Timothy. Well, Deborah, these are many challenging questions, I think. So I think it's only fair to give you now the floor to respond to a couple of these observations.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Mathias. And obviously this panel was organized to do that exactly, to throw up the issues, to bring up the issues, to create, not to say to create a group that would all agree, but to identify all the different issues involved. So I'm now going to be moderating the discussion period at which we've arrived. So I encourage you, if you have questions, it's so bright up here, it's hard for us to see. But if you have questions, please wave or stand up, and I will be very happy to acknowledge you. There certainly are plenty of questions here. And again, one of the purposes of this panel was to raise some of these, get them on the table, and discuss. I want to thank all of the panelists for sketching some of the terrain. What we have not done here, and we're not at a point to do, is to identify the 4 squares. In other words, map out the 4 squares of the terrain that then can be filled in. As has become apparent to those of you who haven't spent time thinking about this before, we're still identifying the terrain, so sketching out that terrain and seeing where we go. Secondly, what has also come across to you, I think, very clearly is how important the need for robust networks in general is to improve overall the security of information systems. Again, work on that, very serious work on that, was begun in 1989. So more than 25 years later, by the most developed countries in the world, 25 of them were working on that very hard and have been doing various things with that. But if you look at the state of security information systems today, it's absolutely deplorable. It's been deplorable, and there are a number of reasons for that, which this panel is not meant to go into, but the lack of incentive structures and so forth. So certainly, in parallel with this or along with this, we are long, long overdue for many reasons: personal activity, commercial activity, governmental activity, delivery of government services to improve the state of information, of the security information systems. One of the things that has come across very clearly here, and quite appropriately, I think, by almost every single person who's spoken, is the need for clear definitions. So there is really a lack of, that's part of defining the terrain or mapping the terrain, a lack of definitions. What are we talking about exactly here? And even at what I would call the threshold level of the distinction between crime, terrorism, and war. Right now we have this very mixed stew where something happens, as Dennis mentioned, Sony hack or whatever, suddenly it's being talked about as terrorism or an act of war. And this is not only happening with regard to things in cyberspace, but in physical space as well. We live in a moment where, you know, anything bad happens, suddenly it's terrorism, or suddenly it's warfare, or whatever. So this need to really clearly define what we're talking about. And one of the reasons, again, that Diana is on this panel is to say, you know, a lot of what happens in cyberspace that we don't like is actually criminal activity. And this is something that we have a long tradition in. We don't have all the laws about cybercrime completely articulated, but we have a long tradition with criminal law, both nationally and globally. We know, being human beings, that every crime invented by humanity will migrate through the internet, and it's doing so in sequence. So that provides us with a very strong tool to, again, render the global networks much more robust. So I'd like to open up for any questions that you may have, but I know that, if I may, while you're assembling, I know Dennis has a comment that he'd like to make, so I'll turn it to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much. I would like to react on some of the points that Edgar made, because his talk was, we were asked to sort of do the fire and brimstone thing, so I think we've done well. But it's a good indication of that one government is a fiction, so it's a useful fiction, but the bigger the government, the more voices there are. There's a number of things, your observations and your obstacles. You said there's no mutual interest, but in the end you sort of talk about network resilience, and I think that is actually one of the places where you may find a lowest common denominator, where we all have a shared interest in keeping the internet as a system of systems, operational. So I think that is ground to work on. Another thing is, you say the law of armed conflict applies. Yes, I agree. I think that is true. On the other hand, there is also a process, and it's been carefully crafted, so it's not a state process, it's the talent process, which you're probably very familiar with, in trying to figure out, okay, where does the law of armed conflict applies just as is, or where do we need to think about it? This is already going into its second round, and is actually headed by an American colonel and legal expert, Mike Schmidt, who also says, in terms of attribution, because Talent 1 was very much about the law of armed conflict in terms of jus in bello, so when there's an actual war going on. And most of the experts say, I mean, cyber warfare will probably never be an isolated event. It will be part of a force multiplier, there will be a general war going on. And if the bombs are hitting, then attribution is probably not your biggest problem. You know where it comes from and you will deal with it. At least that's how the military people seem to think of it. Also, the military people that I talk to in the Netherlands who work on cyber, they say, okay, cyber warfare is really at the very end of the spectrum. It's a very limited subset of what we're talking about, and we need to be much more clear about that. And then you say, okay, there's not much room for norms. And I'm not sure that's true. You say, for example, critical infrastructures, they're already banned by international law. But America is participating in and is actually one of the main sponsors of the UN-GGE process, which is the UN group of governmental experts, which has now had 3 editions, and it's growing. And it is actually about state representatives from the security domain trying to figure out, okay, what is and isn't okay for state behavior in cyberspace. And this has gone into its 3rd leg. I think in September, I think there was the last report they did. And lo and behold, what they put in, for example, was critical infrastructures. Thou shalt not interfere with each other's critical infrastructures. If that is covered under international law, still, 25 countries, or 20 was the last edition, I think it's worthwhile to sit in the room with each other. I talked to the German representative who says, okay, it takes 20 days, 20 guys in a windowless office in the UN building to come to things that are almost too commonsensical for words. But this is how you build sort of trust, this is how you build norms. That is not the end of the story, but I think it is something that needs to be done. And another point is that you say, okay, there is no incentive for government to sort of give up capabilities. And I agree with you to some extent, but I've also heard Sean Canuck, I don't know if I say the name right, but I heard him say basically the same thing in a conference in India twice. But the second time he said it, he added another sentence, and that was interesting. He said, I see no countries giving up the build-up of capabilities in this area before the norms harden. And he added that, and that was an interesting addition to it. He said, because he also realizes that vulnerable though it is, there is a process going on of talking about norms. There is a process, and in the UNGG, China is included, Russia is included. So they are at the table, and they all sort of realize that there will come a point where there will be more norms than there are now. So it is something that is sort of in the corner of their eye. And the last point, I think, was about intelligence gathering. I think you're right, there's never going to be any international treaty regulating that. However, that does not mean that that would be the end of the story. I think in terms of confidence building measures, and I think we can use some confidence building measures in this aspect, it would have to be through national laws, it has to be through oversight. So if the Obama administration strengthens national oversight on the NSA, for example, that would be a confidence building measure that has a radiating effect. The same goes for countries that are enacting new laws for their intelligence agencies, such as in the Netherlands. It's very vital that we make sure good oversight procedures are in place, not just for ourselves, but also for the international effect it may have. Okay, that's it.
Good, thank you very much. Are there any questions in the audience at this point? Yes, please. And I see a gentleman also behind, I think, or a lady behind. The lights are really bad. Please.
Yes, I will maybe start. I have the mic. My question is about this, the notion of the public core of the internet. And I was intrigued because I understood that you saw like a contradiction between this public core of the internet and the possibility of cyberwar. And maybe it's because we have a different understanding of what is public, because I have perhaps the public core of the internet sounds a bit like the natural dimension of the extra-territorial, outer space dimension of the internet. But for me, public means of a certain public, of a certain state. And because there is this public dimension, it means that it is even more involved in war. When we think, what is the public core of television? What is the public core of schools? And where at times of war, television, cinema, schools, all these public things that we have go first. They have the special importance in the war effort. So that was my question.
Thank you very much. So the question is, what is meant by this public core of the internet? Whom would like to respond?
Should I respond?
Yes.
And I could have been clearer about that. I mean public in the sense of a global public good. That's where the word public comes from. It's a little confusing, I do admit. But a global public good in this sense is something that has beneficial characteristics for all society, basically for all birds, but is also in need of international protection. So that's sort of where it comes from. It's not public in the sense of public debate or something like that. So it's good to clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And there was a question. Yes, please.
Yes, I think this is a very fascinating panel, and the issues that are laid out on the table, whether we move forward or not, a lot of it, when I think about the treaties that exist, like no nuclear weapons in space, there was obviously a great deal of concern when countries were able to launch vehicles into low Earth orbit or even take something to the moon, that if you put a nuclear weapon in space, if it loses its orbital integrity, it could fall anywhere. So there was a collective need not to have that happen. The internet is very interesting in part of social and cultural life. The threshold for access is very low. There's a great deal of public support for it. We see what happens when people don't have access to it. But I don't think this conversation about needing to secure it, this is the one thing that I think could really threaten the internet, and that's some kind of really high-scale, intense cyber conflict of some type by powers that have the ability to really cause a lot of damage. I was wondering if you think it can advance the discussion overall if you made this a more low-level discussion among communities and groups who are interested in making sure that the internet is an open, viable platform. Has anyone made any broader attempt to expand on this dialogue and bring more people into the discussion?
Thank you very much. Great question. Who would like to comment on that question? Tim?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Lily. I think that's a good question. I guess I need to make a tactical retreat here based on what Dennis pointed out about norms. And Lily, your question made me think of that, and that is that I think that having discussions about these issues at an international level is useful, including civil society and government. The GGE process at the UN, I think, is useful. I think the Tallinn Manual and sort of sponsored by NATO but not official, was quite useful. And to the extent that that clarifies things that we would hope are blindingly obvious, like you can't attack civilians and cause the lights to go out and cause widespread suffering in a country, because guess what? That violates international law no matter, even without a treaty. That's all to the good. On the issue of surveillance reform and oversight, I think that's a good thing as well. Actually, this is the thing that I'm mainly focused on at the moment. I don't know that it's going to solve the fundamental problem, which is that if you're trying to limit the possibility of cyber war and get us, half an hour from midnight instead of 5 minutes from midnight, you have this big problem that there's going to be valid uses of these kinds of exploits, even with oversight and greater transparency and all the good things we want to do to address post-Snowden surveillance reform. And because there's valid uses for the exploits, it's hard to limit their stockpiling, which could be used for purposes that we may want to limit or even ban. I'm going to take a moment here for a shameless plug. Brown University, where Deb and I both teach, is offering a new master's degree program in the area of cybersecurity, and Deborah is teaching a course on privacy. I'm teaching a course on cyber conflict, which will cover some of these issues as well as issues around regulation and critical infrastructure and cybercrime and others. So check that out so pardon the brief commercial interruption, but I do actually think that we need a lot of study and thought about these issues, and that we're really at the very beginning of that.
Thank you, Tim. I just want to mention, too, one of the things that Tim raised was the idea of bringing existing, a big part of his comments was about bringing existing international law norms into cyberspace. So again, if you think about our community, the kind of internet community, generally there's almost a complete lack of knowledge about international law and the kinds of norms that already exist that can be a basis or can be imported. In addition, in response to the question and building upon what Tim said, if you think about critical infrastructure protection, this has been a huge topic and a huge topic in the United States. There have been several critical infrastructure protection eminent panels that have been stood up by the US government over the last 15 years. I usually get called in at some point to assist them, and there's usually some retired general who's in charge of it, and they go all over the United States and hold a bunch of hearings and produce nothing in the end. So even in terms of identifying critical infrastructure protection, how do we get our arms around that, the electric grid, dams, water supply, et cetera, within the United States itself, which is the one I know the best, we're really nowhere. And so that just again underlines the extreme need for more work here, more work across all domains, not only with regard to warfare, but to make the internet and the cyberspace more resilient. I'm going to take your question in a minute, but I think Dennis has a quick comment on the last question.
Yeah, very quick comment. I think I've been doing the rounds a little on this topic, and I've come to not so much a conclusion, but there's a lot of work to be done in pulling the different communities closer together. I mean, there's separate tracks sort of for what we call sort of the multi-stakeholder thing. Then there's separate tracks for the security. There's separate tracks for the more technical infrastructure, so the technical community. And those, the important discussions, and I think the best discussions happen when you have a good number of each in the room, and which is sort of a dedicated setting. And that happens sometimes, but not very often, especially sort of getting the technical community, for example, to engage with discussions like this, where they know how the thing functions, and they talk to people sometimes who don't really know how the thing functions. There's a lot to be gained there. And it's coming, but it's, we're nowhere there yet.
Thank you very much. Please.
Yes. First of all, I want to agree with the ones that say a definition is one of the most important points we have in this topic. But I also want to address the topic that cyber warfare is a topic. I don't know if we just should look at warfare, because warfare is always something between states and other states. And what we see in the cyberspace, yes, there are state players active, but sometimes it's state players against companies, it's state players directly against citizens of other countries. In other cases, you have organizations, they call them, say, state, but I hope everyone here would agree with me that IS is not a state, they are not a country, they are not a government in any form, so you can't do cyber warfare against them. So I would like to more go to the aspect of punishing criminal activity. We have to define what kind of criminal activity we are talking about and what exactly does this mean. Another topic I lastly saw, for my kind of view, it was always so that I saw DDoS is always an attack. And I spoke to someone lastly and he compared DDoS to a protest where workers' unions closed down the company to protest. It's an online assembly and protected by the right of assembly. And I looked and said, okay, yes, but there are so different views. We have to define what is what and how to deal with this and not only look at state players. It is possible that a single person who has a little bit knowledge shuts down an entire state. So is there cyber war?
Great, thank you very much. Who would like to Diana?
Well, actually, that brings us back to the topic of my presentation. I think at the end where we try to look into it is indeed, is this a criminal activity? Who is responsible for that? And how can we tackle it? And there we go back to the criminal law. But there, again, the problem we have is where do we typify that? Which type of crime is that? And the second problem we have is that even within the EU, criminal law is not harmonized. So it could be that we find a phenomenon which is defined as a criminal activity in Spain, but it's not the same in Italy, in Greece, or in Norway, or wherever. So we end up every time with this type of discussion. So how do we fit this? And can we really ensure that the prosecution takes place? And that's why in EUROJUST also we try to see which is the member state which is best placed to deal with a case, because sometimes a crime is not a crime in a certain member state, but is in another one, and then we can try to advise to move the prosecution in that direction. But again, it's an extremely complex area because it always involves a huge number of member states, because it's difficult to know exactly what happened and so forth. Evidence is another issue, so it is a huge complex thing, and indeed, is a cyber war, is a cyber crime, how do we define it? As I said, I'm not sure myself, but maybe these eminent colleagues know more.
Thank you very much. This is one of the reasons I was so passionate to include criminal law expertise on this panel, although every single person along the way asked me, why are you having EUROJUST on this panel, including EUROJUST herself, or the representative herself, because this is, provides us with a very important, again, in terms of mapping this terrain area to do that. But, and also to respond to another aspect of your question, another hallmark of the internet is the multi-stakeholder nature of it, and an aspect of our era is the proliferation of non-state actors, including within the internet. So that must be taken into account, and then the question becomes, how do we take that into account well? And that is a very live question to which we do not have an answer. We're coming to the end of our panel, so I want to take the prerogative of the moderator to ask each of our panelists here to tell us what they think the next best step would be. And I've asked them, as you can see, to be quite practical. So I'd like them to, again, not to address something idealistic, but if we're, what's the next step here in the next month, the next 6 months, whatever, what would be the best next step to move us to a more sustainable situation in cyberspace? And I'll start with you, Dennis.
Thank you very much. I think this whole process is about baby steps. I mean, it's about bringing the right people in the room and to talk about where you can do something. And what we've seen, for example, with the UNGG example, that it takes 20 days to come out with things which are fairly commonsensical. That may sound ridiculous, but it is the road we need to take, and it is indispensable to do that. To even, for example, the question that you said, to flesh out, okay, what is what, under which legal framework should this be characterized, and there's no alternative for just starting to do that.
Tim?
I think probably the most important thing we should be doing going forward is doing everything we can to secure our critical infrastructure networks against attack because we don't know who the attacker is going to be. We don't know if it's going to be criminal or state-sponsored cyber war. And you know, without doing that, I don't think that these discussions are going to be that useful in preventing the kind of harm that we all want to prevent.
Well, I think here, from my side, I could say it would be important to have the discussion also at EU level. And as I said, there is a lack of harmonization in a lot of these topics. So maybe I can throw the ball back to Mathias, who is now the European Parliament, who could promote more discussion on these issues.
Good. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So I want to thank all of you because this is early in the morning on the last day of the conference, and a conference which is a bit like drinking from a fire hose with all of these events and events that go on until the middle of the night and so forth. So thank you very much for your fortitude and interest in this topic. Thank you for your kind attention. And please join me in sincerely thanking the fellow panelists, Dennis, Mathias, Tim, and Diana. Thank you.